On August 14, 1842, under the choking humidity of a Mississippi summer, a drunken physician named Dr. Silas Beauregard was summoned to Dunmore Plantation in Yazoo County. The message that reached him was brief: 2 women in labor. Come at once. By the time his carriage arrived, the cicadas had fallen silent, and thunder rolled low over the Delta fields. Inside the great house, the mistress, Margaret Dunmore, labored in a candlelit room heavy with the smell of ether and fear. In the slave quarters behind the main house, another woman screamed into the night, a young enslaved woman named Celeste, barely 20, whose contractions mirrored the mistress's to the minute. 2 women, 2 births, and 1 man too far gone in whiskey to know where the line between medicine and madness began. Beauregard had served the plantation families of Yazoo County for more than 2 decades, his hand steady even when his soul was not. But on that night, as rain began to fall in silver ribbons against the shutters, his judgment faltered irreparably. Margaret's child came first, a lifeless boy, his skin pale as ash, the cord wound tight around his neck. The mistress did not weep. She simply turned her face to the wall and whispered, "You will fix this, doctor." Moments later, a midwife arrived from the quarters, breathless, holding a screaming infant born to Celeste. The child was light-skinned, with eyes the color of river mud and a tuft of fair hair, the unmistakable mark of mixed blood. Beauregard, reeking of brandy and guilt, looked from one cradle to the other and felt the weight of a decision that would damn his soul. To report the stillbirth would expose the mistress's long-whispered affair with her husband's overseer. To speak the truth about the enslaved child's complexion would condemn Celeste to punishment or worse. The doctor, trembling, performed an act of mercy, or of cowardice, depending on history's view. He laid the white woman stillborn in the slave woman's arms and placed the crying child into the silk-lined cradle of the Dunmore heir. "Your son lives," he told Margaret, his voice flat and unconvincing. And with that sentence, the bloodlines of Yazoo County were rewritten. Outside, thunder cracked as if to bear witness. Celeste awoke hours later, delirious, believing her baby gone. Beauregard buried the stillborn himself beneath the magnolia trees, marking the grave only with a surgeon's stone. By dawn, plantation bells rang to announce the birth of Elias Dunmore, heir to Dunmore Plantation, son of Thomas and Margaret. In the quarters, Celeste mourned the death of her stillborn, though her body knew otherwise. The milk came unbidden as if to mock her loss. Beauregard rode home at sunrise, soaked, shaking, muttering scripture. He recorded nothing of the night in his official ledger, only the words, "Both mothers delivered. 1 survivor." The following day, Colonel Thomas Dunmore raised a glass to his newborn son, unaware that the blood in that child's veins carried both master and slave. The enslaved community, always alert to what was not said, began to whisper. They had seen the child's coloring, the way the mistress refused to nurse him, the way Celeste collapsed at every sound of the infant's cry. Within a week, Beauregard's drinking worsened, his hands trembling so violently he could no longer perform surgeries without assistance. He began visiting the nursery daily, staring at the baby as if expecting the truth to reveal itself in the boy's face. Margaret, pale and composed, warned him never to speak of that night. To the rest of the county, Elias Dunmore's birth was a miracle after years of childlessness. To Beauregard it was a sentence. The lie was small in its moment, a switch of cradles, a falsified record, but it would ripple outward through decades, crossing war, emancipation, and color lines. Each generation would inherit its part, some the land, others the shame. And yet, for that single night, silence ruled the Delta. Only the doctor knew the truth, and he drowned it nightly in bourbon until his heart failed him 18 years later. What began as a whisper beneath magnolia branches would, by the century's end, become one of the South's most contested scandals. It began here in Yazoo County, 1842, under lightning, deception, and a name that was never meant to belong to the child who bore it. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and how far this story has reached across time. By the autumn of 1842, the Dunmore estate had settled into the quiet rhythm of deception. The infant in the great house, christened Elias Beauregard Dunmore after the doctor who had delivered him, thrived beneath lace canopies and silver rattles. In the quarters, Celeste resumed her field duties with eyes dulled by loss, her arms aching for the child she believed buried under the magnolias. Dr. Silas Beauregard, still haunted by what he had done, began visiting her under the guise of checking her recovery. He brought laudanum for her pain but left each visit more broken than before. He found himself unable to meet her gaze when she asked, was he perfect? Yes, he lied, he was perfect. The lie fermented like the whiskey he drank, sour and unstoppable. Margaret Dunmore, restored to composure, ordered new portraits to be painted of herself with the infant heir, images that would hang for generations as emblems of Southern purity. The painter, oblivious, noted in his journal that the child's skin bore a peculiar olive tone unusual for one of his parentage. Such observations were quickly silenced by wealth. In the meantime, Celeste's child, the true heir, was renamed Samuel and marked as property of the estate. When he turned 6 months old, Colonel Dunmore sold him to a neighboring plantation owner named Josiah Carrington to settle a gambling debt. No record of this sale survives in official ledgers. The transaction was conducted privately, witnessed only by Beauregard and a field overseer. It was, in essence, the second burial of the same child. Margaret's guilt manifested as nightly illness and fever dreams. She began avoiding mirrors, convinced she saw another woman's eyes staring back. The doctor supplied her with morphine tinctures, deepening her dependence while numbing his own. Over time, Elias grew into a fair but solemn boy who recoiled at his mother's touch. He was educated by tutors from New Orleans, studied Latin before breakfast, and rode horses before he could read his own name. He bore, however, a strange resemblance to the stable master's mixed-race son, which gossipers in Yazoo County whispered about behind lace fans. By contrast, young Samuel at the Carrington plantation displayed a startling intellect. He learned to read by candlelight from discarded prayer books, hiding beneath the floorboards of the smokehouse. When Beauregard visited to inspect slaves for illness, a duty he used to justify his presence, he discovered Samuel's literacy. Rather than report it, he began teaching the boy quietly, driven by a desperate need to redeem his crime. The doctor gave Samuel an old anatomy manual, telling him, "You are meant to know what others are forbidden to see." In those hidden lessons, guilt found its penance. Beauregard even wrote letters to Margaret, describing Samuel's progress in coded language. The lost son thrives under another sun. She burned each letter upon reading it, but her nightmares worsened. By 1854, both boys, one a master, one enslaved, were 12 years old and unknowingly bound by the same blood. When they met briefly at a county fair, observers remarked upon their mirrored faces. Colonel Dunmore laughed it off, calling it Providence's jest. But Beauregard turned white as parchment and nearly collapsed. He began drafting a full confession that winter, labeling each page for the record, "When truth is safe again." The hidden child, Samuel, was soon sold again, this time to a physician in Vicksburg named Dr. Abram Yates, who noticed the boy's intelligence and took him on as an apprentice. Under Yates, Samuel learned medicine by proxy, memorizing treatments he could never legally perform. By 1859, his handwriting appeared in Yates's ledgers alongside prescriptions. That same year, Elias Dunmore enrolled at the University of Virginia, his tuition paid from the profits of a cotton season worked by men who shared his blood. Two lives, born in the same hour, had diverged entirely, one toward privilege, the other toward servitude. And at the center of it all, the old doctor drank himself into near ruin, muttering to anyone who would listen that blood has a way of finding its reflection. The reflection would indeed find him soon enough, and history would keep score. If you're still with us, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This story of Mississippi's lost heirs has crossed centuries and now it's reached you. By 1859, Dr. Silas Beauregard was a ghost wandering through his own practice. Once the most respected physician in Yazoo County, he now muttered to himself during consultations, his fingers stained with iodine and bourbon in equal measure. Those who visited his surgery on Main Street recalled the faint smell of mildew, candle wax, and regret. Behind his desk, among dusty apothecary jars, sat a locked ledger embossed with the initials SB, his silent confessional. Inside that book, between records of births, deaths, and inoculations, Beauregard began to chronicle his crime in precise, medical prose. He titled the first entry, "A Substitution of Flesh, August 1842. Each page described the night at Dunmore Plantation with surgical accuracy, the stillborn infant, the trembling midwife, the sound of rain on tin. He wrote of how Margaret's eyes demanded salvation, how Celeste's tears blurred the boundary between medicine and sin. He confessed that he had felt the pulse of one child fade and the other thunder beneath his fingertips, and in that moment, chose deceit over revelation. His handwriting grew erratic after that entry, slanting like a man sliding toward madness. He drank to quiet the whisper that followed him, "You changed the blood." By 1860, his housekeeper, a free woman named Hester Baines, found him collapsed on the floor, clutching the ledger to his chest. He recovered briefly, and ordered her to seal the book and send it to his lawyer in Jackson, in the event of my death or conscience. But war was coming and conscience would have to wait. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Beauregard's medical skills were requisitioned for Confederate service. He was assigned to a field hospital near Vicksburg, the same city where his secret pupil, Samuel, now practiced unofficially under Dr. Abram Yates. Neither man knew they were within miles of one another, both mending wounds carved by the same war that divided their bloodline. Beauregard's decline accelerated amid the carnage. He stopped sleeping, muttering about 2 sons and 1 lie. Fellow surgeons dismissed his ramblings as delirium tremens, unaware that his guilt was not imagined but recorded in black ink, hidden within his satchel. In March 1863 he collapsed during surgery, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he whispered, "Let them trade names as I did." He was buried 2 days later behind a field hospital under a crude wooden cross. His ledger, soaked in rain and blood, was retrieved by a Union soldier scavenging the site after the city's fall. The soldier, Private Nathaniel Crane of Illinois, kept it as a curiosity, believing it to be a physician's diary. When he returned home after the war, he donated a trunk of captured documents to the Hinds County Courthouse in Jackson. The ledger was mislabeled as Medical Account Book, 1840 to 1860. For 35 years, it sat untouched on a courthouse shelf, its ink fading but legible, awaiting discovery. Meanwhile, the consequences of its contents continued to unfold. Elias Dunmore, now a veteran of the Confederate cavalry, returned to Yazoo County to find his plantation reduced to ash and memory. Samuel, the once hidden child, had survived the war tending the wounded in Union camps, earning quiet respect as a Negro doctor without license. Neither man ever knew that the other's face was a mirror of his own. Beauregard's confession, though lost to time, had already written their destinies. His lawyer, never having received the sealed package, assumed the doctor had died penniless and insane. Margaret Dunmore, widowed and consumed by illness, died in 1865, leaving behind only the portrait of her and the false heir, an image that would later hang in the courthouse where the truth was stored just floors below. Hester Baines, the housekeeper, claimed she saw Beauregard's ghost in her dreams every August, whispering, "They will know my name again." It would take nearly half a century for her vision to prove true. When clerks reorganized courthouse archives in 1898, they stumbled upon the ledger, its spine cracked but intact. The discovery would ignite legal battles, family feuds, and public scandal across Mississippi. Beauregard's confession, meant as atonement, would become the match that set the Dunmore bloodline ablaze. His death silenced him, but his words would resurrect the very truth he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. If this story has reached your corner of the world, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. History, like blood, always finds its way home. In the spring of 1866, the war was over, but Mississippi remained haunted. Plantation fields lay fallow, chimneys stood without roofs, and the ledger of Dr. Silas Beauregard slept beneath courthouse dust, its revelations yet unopened. At Dunmore Plantation, now half-burned and bankrupt, Elias Dunmore returned as the master of nothing but a name. His uniform hung loose from hunger, his inheritance reduced to debts and ghosts. In the freedmen's quarters that dotted the property, survivors of the old regime began tilling what they could of the soil. Among them was a man known simply as Samuel, a field medic who had served the Union cause and returned to Yazoo County in search of his mother's grave. He found instead the ruins of the house where he had been born in secret. Neither man, Elias nor Samuel, knew that the other was his brother in blood, their lives drawn together by geography and separated by history's cruelty. Elias, desperate to restore the estate, hired Samuel as a foreman, impressed by his literacy and composure. The irony of that appointment would echo through generations. In the ledgers of 1867, written in Elias's own hand, appear the words, Carter, freedman, to oversee cotton yield for Dunmore lands. Carter was the name Samuel had taken from a Union captain who once protected him from a mob of deserters. He wore it like armor. Over the next decade, the two men rebuilt the plantation together, one by birthright, the other by endurance. Locals began to comment on their resemblance. The same angular jaw, the same inflection in speech. Rumors whispered through church pews and taverns alike that, the master looks like his man. Elias dismissed it with cold laughter, but privately he studied Samuel's face as if confronting a reflection in flawed glass. In 1871, when yellow fever swept through Yazoo County, it was Samuel who treated the sick while Elias fled north to Memphis for safety. When he returned, he found that Samuel had buried 23 victims and saved twice that number. He offered him a share of the harvest as recompense, a radical gesture in a state still defining freedom by color. The local newspaper called it a dangerous precedent of familiarity between races. By 1875, the Dunmore lands began to recover, but ownership blurred in the community's eyes. Samuel married a schoolteacher named Ruth Ann, herself of mixed ancestry, while Elias married a distant cousin from Virginia, Clara Lee. The marriages cemented two separate lineages, one legally white, one legally black, both bearing the same genetic inheritance. Neither family would ever again be wholly pure in blood or in conscience. When Clara gave birth to a son, Thomas Lee Dunmore, his complexion was notably darker than expected. Doctors attributed it to southern air and fever, but midwives whispered that the old Dunmore blood was showing through. At nearly the same time, Samuel's wife gave birth to a boy named Josiah, whose pale skin and gray eyes provoked similar questions among the freedmen's community. Two infants again mirrored one another across racial lines, as if history itself were replaying its cruel joke. In 1879, a visiting preacher recorded in his diary that the Dunmore fields host two families of striking likeness, one in the big house, one in the shanty, neither knowing who truly belongs where. Those who saw the boys together in later years said they could have been twins. By 1883, the first land disputes arose. Elias, desperate for credit, mortgaged a section of the property that Samuel's family had cultivated for more than a decade. Samuel protested, citing promises made verbally, but in the eyes of the law, no freedman could claim title against a white signature. The tension fractured their fragile friendship. Elias died in 1885 of pneumonia, leaving behind unpaid debts and one surviving child, Thomas, then 7 years old. Samuel lived until 1896, respected by his community, still unaware that the man he buried had been his half-brother. Before his death, he reportedly told his wife, "Our stories will cross again when truth becomes a luxury the living can afford." He was buried beneath a pecan tree near the ruins of the old slave quarters. 3 years later, in 1898, when a courthouse clerk named Henry McClellan stumbled upon Beauregard's lost ledger, that prophecy would be fulfilled. The discovery would not just reopen old wounds, it would prove that the bloodlines of master and slave had never been separate at all. If you're watching this far, tell us where you're listening from. The Mississippi Delta may seem distant, but its stories still run through the nation's veins. By the close of the 19th century, Mississippi's air was thick with humidity and hierarchy, one as immovable as the other. The Civil War had ended more than 30 years earlier, yet the state's courthouses still carried the ghosts of its plantations in their archives. It was within one such archive, inside the crumbling Hinds County Courthouse in Jackson, that Henry McClellan, a clerk barely 24, made an accidental discovery. On June 8, 1898, while reorganizing Civil War-era documents damaged by a roof leak, McClellan found a water-stained ledger bound in cracked leather. Its cover bore the initials SB and the faded year 1842. He opened it expecting lists of debts and vaccinations but found instead a confession written in a trembling, methodical hand. The first page began, "I, Silas Beauregard, physician of Yazoo County, do attest that on the night of August 14, 1842, I exchanged two infants, one white, one colored, at the request of their mother and the mercy of my own failing conscience." McClellan stopped reading after that line, his hand shaking. He brought the ledger to his superior clerk J.L. Chambers, who dismissed it as drunken ramblings. But the younger man, sensing its gravity, copied several passages and shared them with a local journalist. Within weeks, the Yazoo Herald published an article titled, "The Beauregard Papers, A Century of Blood Confusion." The county erupted in speculation. The names Dunmore and Beauregard, long synonymous with Southern prestige, were suddenly whispered with scandal. Descendants of both the white Dunmores and the black Carters, Samuel's lineage, lived within a few miles of each other, unaware of the confession's implications. When the newspaper serialized the contents that August, violence followed words. A group of white citizens gathered outside the Carter home, accusing them of fabricating the tale to claim inheritance. Meanwhile, preachers thundered from pulpits that God himself determines blood, not the drunken hand of a doctor. Yet the documentation was irrefutable. Dates, signatures, medical terminology, all consistent with Beauregard's known practice. Court proceedings began that September when Thomas Lee Dunmore, grandson of Elias, filed an injunction against publication of the ledger, claiming defamation. The Mississippi Supreme Court temporarily sealed the document, pending review, citing matters of racial integrity. But the damage was already done. Northern papers seized on the story as a parable of the South's hypocrisy, a white dynasty built upon black blood. Families fled Yazoo County, fearing scandal more than poverty. Local officials burned a portion of the courthouse's redundant archives under the pretense of reducing clutter. Still, multiple handwritten transcriptions of Beauregard's confession had already circulated through academic and abolitionist circles. For historians, the case became known as the Yazoo Confession, one of the earliest recorded instances of racially motivated identity fraud in the antebellum South. In court, the judge admitted the authenticity of the ledger but ruled it without legal bearing, as the subjects were long deceased. Nevertheless, the court of public opinion was relentless. The Dunmore family's social standing collapsed almost overnight. Banks rescinded credit and long-standing partnerships dissolved. Meanwhile, the Carters, descendants of Samuel, were simultaneously ostracized and mythologized as the rightful heirs of the Delta. Interviews conducted by the Jackson Clarion Ledger quoted townspeople saying, "No one knows who's who anymore. The doctor's ghosts are walking." In 1902, McClellan, racked by guilt over the violence his discovery had unleashed, left Mississippi altogether. He joined a Federal Records Commission in Washington, taking with him a personal copy of the ledger's text, which he donated years later to the Library of Congress. That act preserved the only complete version of Beauregard's confession still known to exist. By the time he died in 1921, the two families, White Dunmore and Black Carter, had become living metaphors for the state itself. Bound by soil, divided by law, and forever shadowed by a single night in 1842. The discovery had done what Beauregard himself could not. It resurrected the truth. But in doing so, it made orphans of every name tied to it. If this chapter has reached you tonight, tell us where you're watching from. These stories of blood and history stretch far beyond Mississippi's borders, and they remind us that the past still breathes in every archive we open. By the early 1900s, the Yazoo River once again carried barges heavy with cotton and memory. Mississippi was rebuilding, though its laws were rebuilding differently, brick by brick, Jim Crow by Jim Crow. The names Dunmore and Carter survived, though both were diminished, their genealogies sealed by silence. The ledger of Dr. Beauregard, by then a historical curiosity, was cited briefly in a sociological survey on racial mixture in the postbellum South, before vanishing again into academic obscurity. The people whose lives it had defined returned to survival. The White Dunmores, now small-town bankers and sheriffs, clung to the myth of pure descent. The Black Carters, tenant farmers and teachers, carried the rumor of their stolen inheritance as both burden and pride. In 1913, a census enumerator recorded 2 Dunmore households and 2 Carter households on the same road, each claiming ancestry from the old place, neither daring to say why. Time, that careful accomplice, allowed the lie to fade into folklore. Children in Yazoo County were told of a doctor who swapped the babies, though few believed it. By 1926, when historian Professor Edwin Barron attempted to verify the story for his book Plantations of the Delta, the courthouse clerk denied him access to the sealed documents. "Too much trouble comes from old paper," the man reportedly said. Meanwhile, segregation hardened like plaster. Public schools divided by race taught entirely separate histories. In white classrooms, the Dunmores were founders. In black classrooms, the Carters were forgotten. But the two lineages continued to mirror one another in uncanny ways. During the Great Flood of 1927, both families lost homes and livestock to the river's surge. Photographs from Red Cross records show 2 men, John Dunmore and Henry Carter, standing side by side on a relief barge, unaware they shared great-grandparents. When the Great Migration began in the 1930s, the younger Carters moved north to Chicago and Detroit, seeking factory work. They carried the story of the switched babies as an ancestral parable, part warning, part myth. In 1934, a sociologist from Fisk University, Dr. Lorraine Holt, conducted interviews in the Delta on racial passing. Her notes described one Carter matriarch who whispered, "Our blood runs both sides of the river, but only one side is seen." Those notes, unpublished for decades, became one of the few preserved testimonies connecting the two families after Reconstruction. During the Depression, the remaining Dunmores in Yazoo turned their failing plantation into a lumber business, using the labor of black sharecroppers, some of whom were, unknowingly, their own distant cousins. By 1942, exactly 100 years after the night of the switch, the estate house stood empty, its roof caving in, the magnolias reclaiming the graves beneath. The war pulled men away again, black and white alike, to fight under the same flag in Europe and the Pacific, ignorant of the shared veins that tied their ancestry. In 1955, when Emmett Till's murder drew the world's eyes to Mississippi, Local journalists revisited earlier race scandals, including brief mention of the Dunmore affair. It was dismissed as legend, too old to matter. Yet the families remained tethered by geography. Their children attended segregated schools just miles apart, learning parallel versions of the same false history. By the 1960s, civil rights protests reached Yazoo City. Among the organizers was Ruth Carter Jones, great-granddaughter of Samuel, who carried in her Bible a photocopy of one paragraph from Beauregard's confession, given to her by an archivist in Jackson. She said it reminded her that truth sleeps but does not die. The white Dunmores, now political figures in the State House, worked publicly to preserve Southern heritage, unaware that their very heritage was born of deceit. When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, the two families, one celebrated, one marginalized, were still, in genetic fact, one and the same. Their shared bloodlines had outlived both slavery and segregation, but their reconciliation remained unspoken. Only in private conversations did older residents whisper that the ghosts of Dunmore and Carter still walked the levees together. By century's midpoint, the Beauregard story had become a metaphor rather than a record, told in sermons, folklore, and whispered warnings about what happens when men try to master lineage itself. The truth waited once more in silence, like a body preserved in courthouse dust, waiting for a generation unafraid to exhume it. If you're still watching, tell us where you're joining from. These stories of lost ancestry belong to everyone who's ever searched their roots and found history looking back. By 1972, the state of Mississippi was attempting to modernize its image, though its courthouses still carried the same wood, the same dust, and often the same ghosts. The Dunmore and Carter descendants, scattered across the South and Midwest, had long ceased to speak the same language of family. One branch spoke of heritage, the other of injustice. Yet both names reappeared unexpectedly that spring in a legal petition filed at the Yazoo County Chancery Court. The petitioner was attorney Claudine Harper, a civil rights lawyer from Jackson, representing three descendants of Samuel Carter. Her claim was unprecedented, that the Dunmore estate, now valued at nearly $500,000, had been built on fraudulent racial classification, originating from Dr. Silas Beauregard's Act of Substitution in 1842. She cited new evidence, a certified transcript of Beauregard's ledger obtained from the Library of Congress by historian Dr. Edwin Barron, who had located McClellan's copy. The document, she argued, proved that Samuel Carter was the rightful biological heir to the Dunmore property. The case was titled Carter et al. v. State of Mississippi and the Dunmore Estate, 1972. No court in the South had ever ruled on a matter that combined racial identity, property law, and posthumous fraud. When the petition reached the state Supreme Court, it ignited national interest. Time magazine called it a trial where race, inheritance, and science share the witness stand. The white Dunmore descendants, led by Robert Lee Dunmore, dismissed it as ancestral fiction. They hired a team of attorneys who argued that genetic lineage had no bearing on property rights long extinguished. But the Carter family's attorney had anticipated that. She introduced evidence from blood typing, then an emerging forensic method, showing shared rare markers between the two family lines. The tests, performed at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, indicated a statistical probability of relatedness exceeding 90%. In the packed Jackson courtroom that August, photographs of both families were displayed side by side. Observers noted the identical jawlines, the same amber-gray eyes that seemed to echo through time. 4 weeks, testimony alternated between genealogists, archivists, and historians. Dr. Barron took the stand to confirm the authenticity of Beauregard's confession, describing the pages as the most damning self-indictment of the antebellum conscience ever recorded. He read aloud the doctor's final entry, "If ever truth returns to this land, it will wear both faces." Those words hung over the courtroom like a curse and a prophecy. The state's argument rested on precedent, that racial classification, once codified, could not be retroactively revised. History, the state attorney declared, is not subject to DNA. Yet the moral weight of the case was undeniable. Reporters flooded Jackson, dubbing it the bloodline trial. Elderly locals came forward with oral histories corroborating that the doctor switched the babies to save the mistress's name. Despite this, on November 3, 1972, the court ruled against the Carter family, citing statutes of repose. Too much time had passed for restitution. Still, the ruling included a remarkable footnote written by Justice Marion Tate, the first black woman to sit on the bench in Mississippi's history. She wrote, "Though law cannot mend the dead, truth may yet mend the living. The record of this deceit shall remain open for public learning." That sentence transformed the case from failure to legacy. Following the verdict, universities began offering seminars on racial identity in American jurisprudence, using Carter v. State as a landmark. Both families, now publicly intertwined, received letters from journalists, historians, and filmmakers. Some Dunmores denied relation. Others privately contacted the Carters, seeking reconciliation away from the cameras. In 1973, geneticist Dr. William Hargrove confirmed through expanded blood group analysis that the two families shared a common maternal ancestor, most likely Celeste of Dunmore Plantation. The discovery, though not legally binding, made national headlines. The Washington Post described it as a case where blood outlived law. For the Carters, the trial brought visibility but no restitution. For the Dunmores, it brought exposure without closure. Both families, once divided by the doctor's hands, were now bound together by the paper trail he left behind. Beauregard's confession had finally achieved what its author intended: acknowledgement. A century and 30 years after the night of the switch, the truth stood in court, not as vengeance but as record. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. History isn't distant. It lives wherever we choose to confront it. In the autumn of 1992, the Mississippi sun fell over the overgrown ruins of Dunmore Plantation for the first memorial held there in 150 years. The magnolias had thickened, their roots twisting through forgotten graves. Only the brick steps of the main house remained. On those steps stood descendants of both families, Carter and Dunmore, facing each other for the first time without lawyers, overseers, or chains. The gathering was organized by Dr. Ruth Carter Jones, a historian and great-great-granddaughter of Samuel, whose family had once been denied the right to stand on that ground. She called it the Beauregard Reconciliation. Among the attendees was Judge Marion Tate, now retired, who read aloud the closing lines from Beauregard's ledger, preserved under glass. "Let truth return when mercy allows." The words, once a whisper of guilt, had become the invocation of healing. Photographs from that day show former adversaries clasping hands beneath the oak where Elias and Samuel once worked side by side. DNA testing, then a new technology, confirmed what history had already confessed: that both families shared direct maternal ancestry through Celeste, the enslaved woman whose child had been stolen. Her name was etched on a bronze plaque placed at the site that afternoon, beneath the inscription, "Mother of two sons, one history." Local newspapers called it Mississippi's longest confession. The state formally recognized the site as a historical landmark in 1994, marking it as one of the first memorials to explore racial identity through genetic evidence. High school curricula began including Carter v. State, 1972, as a case study on restorative justice. At the University of Mississippi, students analyzed Beauregard's ledger in courses on medical ethics and the psychology of guilt. Meanwhile, family reunions between Carters and Dunmores became annual events, alternating between Yazoo County and Chicago. Each year they read from both lines' genealogical trees, one written in courthouse ink, the other in oral tradition, now joined as one. Elder James Dunmore, once resistant to the truth, would later say, "The doctor thought he changed bloodlines, but all he did was delay the truth." The plantation soil, tested by archaeologists in 2001, revealed unmarked graves, evidence of enslaved families whose records ended in silence but whose DNA remained traceable. Descendants volunteered for testing, creating one of the first interracial genealogical databases in Mississippi. Forensic analysis confirmed shared markers between 27 participants, bridging families separated since emancipation. The results were published in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies under the title, "The Beauregard Exchange, a genetic reconstruction of a lost lineage." Through that research, Celeste's descendants reclaimed a history denied to her in life. By 2010, the memorial site hosted annual educational programs for students studying ethics, medicine, and law, disciplines forever linked by one doctor's error and confession. Dr. Ruth Carter Jones passed away in 2014, buried beneath the same pecan tree where Samuel's grave rested a century earlier. Her tombstone bore no family division, only the words, "Truth returned." In 2020, amid renewed national debates on race and ancestry, the Beauregard ledger was digitized and made publicly accessible through the National Archives. Researchers worldwide downloaded its scanned pages, a 19th-century confession now circulating through 21st-century networks. Modern descendants from both families continue to test their DNA, confirming the same pattern of shared blood that the doctor once tried to conceal. At a symposium that same year, geneticist Dr. Alicia Grant summarized the case with chilling precision. The Beauregard switch was not just a medical event, it was the template of America, blood crossing boundaries it was never meant to cross. Today, a small museum stands near the site of the former plantation, housing the doctor's tools, fragments of letters, and the silver cradle that once held the switched child. Visitors describe an atmosphere both sacred and unsettling, a place where history still breathes through the cracks in brick and bone. The final exhibit plays a recording of Ruth Carter Jones's voice. We cannot change what was done, but we can decide whose names are remembered. Outside, the wind moves through the magnolias, the same sound that accompanied the doctor's sin, now the whisper of reconciliation. The story of the Dunmores and the Carters has become more than local history. It is a study in inheritance, in how nations inherit silence as surely as they inherit blood. Every generation that reads Beauregard's confession adds a new signature to its moral ledger. What began as deceit in 1842 ended as documentation, testimony, and truth. The investigation revealed that even buried histories can breathe again when uncovered with care. If you followed this story to its end, let us know where you're watching from. This is not just Mississippi's past, it's a reminder that truth, though delayed, is never denied.